Thank you very, very much, Miguel, and it is such a pleasure for me to be here with you today. And I left Dublin in sunshine, but I come to somewhere that makes me feel very, very at home, Bilbao. Thank you. Thank you very much. So today, the subject of my talk, as Miguel says, is really thinking about the role that a particular gallery plays in the civic culture of a city, but also by extension, the national culture as well too. And I have been as director of the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin for 18 months. So I'm still very new in my stage there, but I am very, very impressed always by how integrated, how loved the gallery is within the city and within public life. And I really want to talk about the model of that in Dublin today. It's a subject that I've been interested in for a long time, and Miguel has very kindly referred to the book that I published recently on the subject of cities and their importance in an artistic context, for bad sometimes as well as for good. But I want to talk about a more positive example today, which is that of Dublin. And my thinking on this subject has also been informed by, as Miguel said, the long period of time I spent working at one of the other two national galleries in what I will very un-Irishly call the British Isles. I have to refer to them as these islands generally, for reasons that you will well understand. But the National Gallery in London, of course, was the model for many national galleries, including the institution I run in Dublin, and I am very struck by the differences in between which it is integrated in the city, but actually how the Dublin Gallery is much more integrated within the life of the city and the life of its people. And my thinking on the subject is also very much shaped by my own upbringing. I grew up about 160 kilometres from Dublin, on the island of Ireland, but in a different state. I grew up in Belfast, and I grew up in Belfast during the period that is known as the Troubles. And at the time, I had no understanding that life could be ever different. I thought that was just the way things were. But looking back, I think the thing that struck me most is that Belfast is an incredibly vibrant city, but where the cultural life from that period was not working. But it was through Belfast's artists and Belfast's poets that we had the greatest sense of the horror of what was going on. And on the screen, I show you a view of my very, very beautiful home city, from the shipyards to the mountains, and also one of its most extraordinary poets, Michael Longley, who is now in his 80s and very unwell. Michael Longley lived very, very close to where I grew up, and when I was a teenager, he wrote a poem about an incident which upset me and his daughter and many others very much, was when the man who sold us ice cream on the Lisburn Road in Belfast was shot. And he wrote a poem which combined ice cream flavours with the flowers of Belfast and of Ireland. And I won't read it to you because it would make me cry. But I think thinking that experience is one that obviously resonates deep with all of us who lived in that city through its very difficult and very challenging moments. But it also gives me optimism of what cities and what art galleries actually can do to make things better. And one of the things I feel very strongly is that art, of course, is in galleries, but it's also all around us. And this is a rather facetious slide of the art that I encounter on my way to work in Dublin, from the coffee cup I use first thing in the morning, to the streets I walk along, these beautiful urban vistas, and to the pictures I and others encounter, I before the gallery opens to the public, but others once we open at 9:15 in the morning. And often my morning painting, as of many others, is Johannes's Vermeer, Woman Writing a Letter with Her Maid, which I will come back to later in this talk as well. But But today I want to focus, as I've said, really on the experience of Dublin. And Dublin, as Miguel said, is not just home to one of the really great art collections of Europe, and I'm glad you said that too, Miguel. It's not just me shouting from my gallery, but also one of the great Enlightenment cities of Europe as well too. I'm showing you a view of Trinity College, one of the two major universities in Dublin, from the very end of the 18th century. This is the period where Dublin was in some ways at its zenith, at least until the late 20th and 21st century. This was when great buildings of the sort of Trinity's facade were put up. It was the time also when many of the learned societies, which still flourish and are a very vibrant part of Dublin life, were founded. From the Royal Dublin Society at the top left of my screen. This is a society which was founded in 1731, really for the promotion of science and industry. The Royal Irish Academy, which is an all-Ireland body for academics. The Royal Irish Academy of Music, which does what it says. And the Royal Hibernian Academy, founded in 1823, though in a very modern building today, which is again the all-Ireland body for artists. But things became much more difficult in Dublin in the very end of the 18th and the early 19th century. You may know that there was a rebellion which failed in Ireland against British rule in 1798. As a result of that, the Parliament in Ireland was dissolved and Ireland was ruled much more directly from London. And this had really, really cataclysmic impact on Irish life. And the worst impact of that, of all, is the event which is known as the Great Hunger in Irish, or the Great Famine. And I am showing you some of the most distressing reportage from this moment. Drawings made by the artist and journalist James Mahoney, who went round parts of Ireland in the late 1840s, looking at the effect of the famine. You may know the story. The potato crop, which was the main subsistence of Irish people, failed. Ireland was still being asked to export many of its other foodstuffs to England and by extension to the English Empire. And many people died and many more people left the country. Ireland's population only reached its pre-famine level 2 years ago in 2022, which is quite a figure. But I'm telling you this story because it's very important for the foundation of the National Gallery of Ireland. This is a painting which is really absolutely contemporary with the founding of the gallery, painted by a Scottish artist called Erskine Nicholl the year before the gallery was founded in 1853. As part of the results that came from the famine, many families were evicted from their land, and this created appalling problems and really created not just the famine, but worsened that and the migration. But the gallery was founded as a result of an attempt to bring something more positive for the people who had suffered this terrible loss into Ireland, into Dublin, and by extension across the island. And this was based, as many enterprises were in the 1850s, on the Great Exhibition, which happened in Hyde Park in London in 1851. And a version was held in Dublin in 1853. It was held right in the centre of the city, on what is called Leinster Lawn. It's today where the Irish Parliament meets, and on either side of that building, really as a result of the exhibition of 1853, are the National Gallery of Ireland and the National Museum of Ireland. So there's really a museum quarter round the Parliament in Ireland as a result of the exhibition. So the exhibition was like many exhibitions of its kind. It showed art, it showed industry, and the main mover behind it was the individual I'm showing you here in this image on the screen. This is William Dargan, who was from Cork in the far south of Ireland, and he built railways across the island in the 1840s and 1830s. He was the main supporter of the Industrial Exhibition of 1853, and he was the main instigator of the National Gallery of Ireland, whose statue now stands in one of our courtyards at one of our entrances of the museum, and he led the movement to found the gallery in 1854. Now, founding a museum is an easier enterprise than building a museum, and it took 10 years for the gallery to open. The designs were made by an Irish engineer, incidentally also from Belfast, called Francis Fowke, who went on to design the Royal Albert Hall in London. And Fowke's designs, and I show you two of them from the many we have in our archive in Dublin, were remarkable. We had the first air conditioning system in a museum in Dublin. We also had the first gas lighting system. Now, that was remarkable in 1854 and 1864 when the gallery opened. It was less remarkable to see these still in use, I think, in the 1950s and 60s. But the building, as has now been refurbished, is completely magnificent and really is a palace to art, which was exactly what Dargan, Fowke, and the other people who founded the institution had intended. And when the gallery opened in 1864, and this is an image from the Illustrated London News, which was the main source really of news throughout the islands of Britain and Ireland in the mid-19th century. It's the 19th century equivalent really of the BBC and RTE, the state broadcaster in the Republic of Ireland. So everybody came to see the opening of the gallery. And the grand gallery that you see here was Fowke's great genius and achievement. A problem with the opening of the gallery was there was a great building, but there weren't very many pictures at this point. So our friends in London were incredibly generous. 110 of the paintings in the gallery when it opened were on loan from the National Gallery in London. And the gallery's acquisitions policy under its first director, George Mulvaney, who I'm showing you here on this screen, was essentially to buy very large paintings to fill the wall space as quickly as possible. But there were some other motivations behind the gallery's foundation and its audiences which were clear from the start. One was that this was intended to be a home for artists. It was a place where artists would learn, where artists would participate, though not at that moment a place where contemporary artists themselves would exhibit. And we still have a very strong connection with living artists in the governance of the gallery. The lady who you see on the screen is one of our current board members, Abigail O'Brien. She is also president of the Royal Hibernian Academy, and since 1854, the president of the Royal Hibernian Academy and two other artists have always sat on our board. And it is really important to have that connection, and it's one which I and my predecessor have developed further. That connection with the living world of art is so vital and so important, even for a museum that is largely of historic painting. So the gallery was always a place for studying, and I love this image from the 1880s of an artist at work in the gallery with not just the paintings that were acquired, but the sculpture and the plaster casts of famous works of art, which were displayed, as you saw in many other European museums of this date, to really try and educate artists and enable them to continue and improve on their artistic journey. The other real motivation of the gallery was one that I think today we possibly might feel is rather simplistic, but I think it's still a very good motivation. It was really to improve people's lives by exposing them to important works of art. And the concentration of the gallery in the earlier period of its existence was not, strangely, for the National Gallery of Ireland to be buying work by Irish artists, but it was primarily to be buying work by artists working in the broader European tradition. So Carlo Maratta's Rape of Europa, painted in Rome around the year 1700, was one of the very first paintings bought by the gallery in Rome, with a group of works, also quite large, in the 1870s and 1880s. And there was also a sense that the canon of Western art, of Italian art, of Spanish art predominantly, and a bit of French, was what was going to be really important in improving morals and improving the sense of the Irish people, which was one of the motivations of Dargan and the other founders of the gallery. The gallery has had, we're in the 170th year of our foundation this year, and during this time, the gallery has only closed on 2 occasions. One was, of course, the terrible pandemic of a couple of years ago, and the first was the episode I'm showing you on the screen. It was during the Irish Civil War. Ireland went through a very tumultuous decade from about 1912 to 1922, the years running up to the First World War, the Rising in 1916, and then the establishment of the Irish state. I rather approve of the laconic description of the damage that the gallery underwent in 1922. On this image here, I'm showing you below the photograph of the gallery with some of the pictures taken down, the board minutes, and it says, "The director reported that damage had been done to the building by gunfire and that the matter was being attended to." That's it, nothing more. Everything had been closed, the gallery had shut, but it was all being worked out and sorted out. And the gallery continued to open through all of that difficult period, and indeed also through the period known elsewhere as the Second World War, but known as Ireland as the emergency. So what I want to really talk about now is not go through the history of the gallery. Not only, I think, would that not be so exciting, but also to think about how the history that was established by the gallery's founders and these 2 real attention given to the artistic community and to the wider public have shaped our activity through that period and continue to do so today. One reason, one result of this is that the gallery has always been a place of solace and of repose and of discovery, I think, for many people. And possibly the person who articulated that most clearly, and then also financially, was the writer George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw, who's probably most familiar today for Pygmalion, the play that became the musical My Fair Lady. He was born in Dublin into a very lonely and very unhappy household in Portobello on the canal, at that time quite a poor part of the city. And he wrote that the gallery was possibly the only place in Dublin, certainly not his family, where he felt welcomed and where he felt loved and where there was a place for him. And when he died in the early 1950s, he left his estate partly to the establishment of an equivalent of Esperanto, a universal language, and the rest to the National Gallery of Ireland for whatever purposes it saw fit. And we have used the royalties from Shaw's literary estate to construct buildings such as the Millennium Wing, which I show you on the screen here, and also to make some really significant acquisitions, over 200 actually to this date. The Shaw Fund is just winding up because it's 75 years now since Shaw died. So if any of you know of somebody who might be prepared to give their royalties to the gallery for a continuing acquisition fund, I'd love to hear from you. But here are 2 of the very diverse pictures that have been acquired with Shaw's money. A very early Irish painting from the 18th century, painted by Nathaniel Hone, who's one of the fathers of Irish painting in the 18th century, and a painting by possibly an Italian artist resident in Avignon in the 1430s. I'm showing you this because I'm a specialist in Italian Renaissance art, and it's a wonderful acquisition and something which is very unusual to find. And the Dublin collection is full of these sorts of treasures because of Shaw and because of other people who have been so generous towards us. So I want to talk a little bit more about how acquisitions really shape the sense of identity in the city and among the people of Dublin. And one way of doing that is by the certain works of Irish art, which are really, really, really beloved. And one of these is this painting by Jack B. Yeats. Yeats comes from an extraordinary family. His brother was the poet W.B. Yeats. They had two magnificent sisters, Lolly and Lily, whose work is only really being appreciated today. But Jack Butler is possibly the greatest Irish artist of the early 20th century. And his style moves from this more realist, not quite realist, but more mode, to something that's really akin to the expressionism of Kokoschka, but it's totally unique and very romantic and very mystic. This is Yeats' painting of an event which still happens most years, not every year in Dublin, when some brave and insane people swim up the River Liffey, which is a tidal river, and mercifully they're not polluted anymore because we have salmon back in the Liffey. It's very clean, but it is quite an extraordinary event. And the Liffey swim, also Yeats's portrait of it, is very important in Ireland because it actually won Ireland its first Olympic medal 100 years ago in 1924. Ireland competed in the Olympics as an independent state for the first time in that year. And in the Cultural Olympiad, which at that point was part of the Olympics, pictures and poems and other things won medals as well as races. And we are showing this painting in the gallery at the moment with the silver medal that Yeats won. And people are coming in very, very, very large numbers to see it. It's really exciting and lovely. And actually, even before we put it up at the beginning of the year, people were writing to me saying, when are you going to put the Liffey swim up with Yeats's medal? You've got to do it this year, and you've got to do it before the Olympics. So, of course, we found a way. We also have the National Portrait Collection, which was founded in 1875, but we continue to add to that very, very importantly, and that, of course, is one of the ways in which we work with living artists. Probably the most popular portrait in the collection at the moment is this picture of someone who may not be known to you in Bilbao. This is the Irish comedian Graham Norton, who is an absolute total star and known to everyone in Britain and Ireland. When we take this painting down, we have complaints. The other thing that leads to complaints is this beautiful elegiac portrait of Seamus Heaney, who's probably the most beloved poet in Ireland. He's no longer still with us, but this image of him in his kitchen by the photographer Jackie Nickerson is something which our audiences really love. And a difference I really find between the National Gallery of Ireland and the National Gallery of London is that people do not hold back in telling you what you think at any moment about the displays. Dublin is quite a small city. We have a population of about 1.8 million. The gallery has an audience of about 1 million. That's about half visitors and half Irish people. So many, many people in Dublin and many people in Ireland come to the gallery regularly, and a lot of people will visit once a year. But what's also interesting about the sense of identity that people have with our collection is that it is not just restricted to the Irish paintings. I often hear people talking about our Vermeer. It's not the gallery's Vermeer, it's our Vermeer. And when the painting went to the Vermeer exhibition in Amsterdam last year, which brought together the 37 paintings by Vermeer in the world, this was a subject of real civic and actually national pride. And that is extraordinary. There are few national galleries, I think, where there is that sense of love and of identity with all parts of the collection. Another picture of which people are incredibly proud is one of the two Caravaggios that you see on the screen behind the politicians and dignitaries. That is the painting that is on the right-hand side, the Taking of Christ. It is presently in Belfast in Northern Ireland, together with a great painting that our friend Gabriele Finaldi has lent from London, the Supper at Emmaus. The two paintings were made for the same patron in Rome in the early 17th century. But the two pictures pictures are in Belfast at the moment in a really important act of cross-border collaboration and communication. Everyone's very happy that the picture has gone to Dublin, but people are desperate for it to come back and really counting the days into the 1st of September when it comes back down south again. I just really do find in my move back to Ireland this sense of identity and interest in individual objects as well as the collection to be really compelling, and a sense of the role that the gallery does have in the life of the city and of people. One other incident which is very, very moving to watch is something which is unique to Dublin and the city of Edinburgh. In Dublin, as in Edinburgh, we have a group of watercolours by the English painter and draftsman Turner, which were given by the same individual, Henry Vaughan, in 1900. And I can see some of you thinking, I can see the wows at the colour here. This is because these objects are only allowed to be exhibited in the month of January. And we have people queuing outside the gallery, literally on New Year's Day, to come in and to see the watercolours from the Vaughan bequest. This particular view of the lake at Petworth is a favourite of many. But again, it is unusual to find collections which grab people in the way that objects do in Dublin. Another, taking even beyond the walls of the gallery, is a painting which is actually tiny. This is a picture by Frederick William Burton called The Meeting on the Turret Stairs. It's a watercolour. It's about this size, and we have to, because it's a watercolour, we're not supposed to exhibit it very much. But it's so popular that we keep it in a box in the gallery, and we show it for 2 hours, 2 days a week, and all day on Valentine's Day. And the reason that people love this is, I think you can guess, people come and get engaged in front of this picture because for many, many years there has been a very poor reproduction of it in the registry office in Dublin. So people marry regularly in front of this painting as well too, and then they come to the gallery to see it. And it's very special on Valentine's Day when many of those who've married in front of the work come into the gallery to see the real object for themselves. I wanted to move on from the love that the gallery has in people's hearts to how we are trying to deal with questions of identity really in our displays, in our collections, and also how we continue to work with living artists and with others to make acquisitions that we hope will be part of civic and cultural life. I'm showing you here a group of works, not all of them, by the British-Irish artist Hughie O'Donoghue. They're called Original Sins, and they are Hughie's very, very poetic and very wonderful reflections on the complexity of Irish and British relations, which have gone back in a very contested form, in some cases, over many centuries. These works hang in a room at the gallery, which is dominated at one end by a huge painting of the marriage of Aoife and Strongbow. Now, you, unlike me, have not gone to school in Ireland, so you will not know the story of the Princess Aoife, who was forcibly married to Strongbow, who was the English general who came over to Ireland in the Middle Ages to basically take over Ireland initially for the English. And Maclise's painting is a very political painting. It hung in the Houses of Parliament in London for a long time. It's now on our walls. It's a painting which every child in the country knows. And Hughie O'Donoghue was asked to respond to that work in a way which really thought about the complexities and difficulties, but also the positive aspects of this long relationship. And Ireland did one thing incredibly well in the last 10 years, and that was how, well, many, but one thing was how it responded to the contested past by a fellow festival called the Decade of Centenaries, which addressed the difficult problems of Irish history, but didn't try and airbrush them. It tried to talk about difference and to do that in a measured way, and I think that's had a large role in bringing different communities across the island together. So we at the gallery have been very, very happy to take a very active participatory role in this continuing process. Another way in which we continue to engage with the public is, of course, by soliciting suggestions for our national portrait collection. And this leads us to be more nimble and more flexible, and I think also less sort of establishment bound than our predecessors might have been in the past. One of the most popular writers in Ireland, in fact, in the English-speaking world, is Marian Keyes, who writes not high literature, but very, very movingly about alcoholism, about mental health, and actually very amusingly too. And we commissioned Margaret Corcoran to make a portrait of Marian earlier this year, which I think is going to rival Graham Norton for the most popular work in the collection. The portrait collection is an area where we can be more nimble and where we can change more regularly, really in a way of adapting and relating to current trends in Ireland and Irish society more broadly. But another area in which we can also do that, though not necessarily in an Irish way, is thinking of objects in terms of acquisitions which talk to issues. And one major issue which many of us in the museum world have been very exercised about is how do we tell the story of women in historic collections? Because there were not that many women artists who were able to work and succeed for large periods of human history. So last year we spent a lot of money from our acquisition budget on this beautiful still life by Raquel Roysch, one of the most important Dutch painters of the 17th century, a pioneer of flower painting. Probably the moment to buy Raquel Roysch was 20 years ago rather than today, but we felt it was very important to make this acquisition, not simply because of her gender, not simply because of her age, she was over 70 when she made this work, but because it's an extraordinarily beautiful and important work of art, one which enables us to talk about the wider world. You'll see there's a corn husk in it, so we can talk about globalization through that, but also actually, it's the first still life, actually, strangely, in our collection of a flower painting. Very odd in such a great European collection that we didn't have any of those before. But it's a painting that, again, is really resonating with our visitors and our audiences. Thinking about Irish art and its representation is, of course, a significant part of our role too. And Irish art has developed in ways that are not just the more conventional pictorial arts, at least in a historic sense, of painting, of sculpture, and of architecture and photography. But stained glass is a medium which in Ireland has had enormous significance since the end of the 19th century. And at the end of last year, we were able to acquire as a Christmas present to the Irish nation this tiny panel by Harry Clarke, someone who worked really in the vein of Aubrey Beardsley, a symbolist artist who made very few works, and we have 3 of them in the collection now. This is his evocation of the enchantment of Botton from Shakespeare's Midsummer's Night Dream. But how you display works like this in a collection predominantly of paintings is quite challenging, but we have found ways. And again, it's an acquisition that really is resonating and being enjoyed by our visitors. I wanted to draw this talk to a conclusion by really thinking about programming. And one ways, of course, in which we program and work with audiences and communities is through education. The gallery actually has a very distinguished history of working with children, with families, and with wider audiences. And something that people often talk to me in Dublin with great nostalgia, and we're probably going to need to bring it back, is a Christmas quiz, which happened through the gallery, I think through the 1950s, 60s, 70s and 80s, where children were invited into the space and essentially allowed to run through the gallery and find objects in the collection. But I think it was a really good way of introducing many people to a gallery in a non-contentious way, and a way that really broke down the barriers that can still exist of entering a place that can be as daunting as the museums we inhabit. And I just wanted to show you here the individual who really started that, who was one of my predecessors, James White, who again was rather like Kenneth Clarke in England. He was always over the television. He was a fantastic communicator. He may not have been the most brilliant art historian, but he made up for it in many other very, very important ways. And we work very significantly with schools and with groups. Of course, all museums do, but the size of Ireland means that we're accustomed to having, kids coming from length and breadth of the country in buses to come to the gallery. And the scene I show you here of a class having their photograph taken outside is something which really happens in our courtyard most days. We're also now trying to work with schools in inner city Dublin, and again, really to break down the barriers of people who might live only, half a kilometre from the gallery, but would never think of darkening its doors. And here on the slide, on the image above, you see St Christopher's National School, who are one of 3 schools we invited to do a residency in the gallery this year. They spent a week with us in May. They did all their lessons from maths to science and art in the gallery space. It's a fantastic initiative, and one which we are trying to find ways in which we can roll out outside Ireland and also perhaps in other museums. It's a model that's very time intensive, but we're seeing huge benefit in our local community engaging, and families who might not have come into the gallery in several generations living in the council flats nearby are now coming in because their children have come in for their schooling and the children are bringing them too. I'm going to pass over National Drawing Day because I want to talk about another way in which we're trying to work not just with the artistic community, but also with younger artists. One of the major challenges for museums in building community and a civic role is how do you continue to grow a younger audience? And some people say, well, you don't need to worry because people get older and then they will come into museums. But I really don't think that's the way to work. And I'm sure none of you do too. We have a portrait prize which we run annually with the support of one of the main banks in Ireland, Allied Irish Bank. We have a prize for professional artists, which last year was won by the photographer David Booth, and I show you his very wonderful photograph of a couple separated more than being connected in a small town in Ireland above, and below the very proud figure of 15-year-old Rory Condon, a teenager from Dublin who told me he hadn't really drawn much before a year ago, who won the annual Portrait Prize, which last year was judged by the director of the National Portrait Gallery in London, the artist Dorothy Cross, and a very serious, important curator, Anne Stewart. He was thrilled. I mean, the difference that it will make to his life, I think, of something like this is quite extraordinary. So for our Portrait Prize, it's as important for us to work with younger audiences as it is for us to grow and develop our connections with the still rather embattled community of living artists in Ireland. I just want to end by talking about a couple of exhibitions that we're very proud of being able to have delivered at the gallery, because the way they have used historic art to resonate with contemporary audiences. The big image that I'm showing you on the screen is a painting by the Renaissance Italian artist, the Bolognese artist, Lavinia Fontana. This came into the collection in 1870. It's very familiar to Dublin audiences, but before last year, they probably wouldn't have known the name of the artist. They would have just walked past the painting. We did a very big, very expensive, but I think really important exhibition on Fontana. Fontana is an artist who has had attention in Spain. I think of the wonderful show that Leticia did at the Prado in 2019, which included her and Sofonisba Anguissola. But this exhibition was the first monographic show on Fontana for many years, and indeed the first major monographic exhibition devoted to a woman artist at the National Gallery of Art at Ireland. That's something actually which I think is rather shameful. But I'm glad we have been able to begin this process of really integrating female artists as well into not just our displays, but also into our exhibition programme. And the reason I couldn't be with you yesterday was because we opened yesterday an exhibition of women impressionists, a subject I know is close to your heart also here in Bilbao, really celebrating two important acquisitions which the National Gallery of Ireland Ireland, made in the 1930s and 1950s, one of the first public museums to buy paintings by the women impressionists. And we have a show we've done in collaboration with Ordrip Guard, which opened yesterday, putting this beautiful Eva Gonzalez of the sand dunes at Grand Camp and our lovely Morisot portrait into a wider context. But the challenge I think that we really see is that of engaging successfully with younger audiences so that they remain our audience in the future. And we're finding ways, and I've talked about a few, where we, I think, have successfully managed to do this. And it's one of our great strategic priorities in years ahead, so that a child like Cian here, who came into the gallery to see our Turning Heads exhibition of Rembrandt, Rubens and Vermeer, which closed in May, wasn't put off by it, but has come back and indeed will come again and again. And it was really happy serendipity that when we were reached the figure of our millionth visitor last year in December 2023, the three who came through the door were this mother and her two very delightful and very happily drawing children. I think that museums should be a space for everyone, and it's important for us running institutions like this and Bilbao and others that we find a way for repose and solace and enjoyment, the qualities that brought George Bernard Shaw as a young man to the National Gallery, but that we also find a place for real fun, enjoyment, exuberance, and life and art being made in these places, not just a repository for them. And I want to end on a very, very personal note. I first came to the National Gallery of Ireland as a child with my mother. She brought me down on the train from Belfast. We were supposed to be spending a day of shopping and of going to the theatre, but we started our day at the National Gallery of Ireland, and we started looking at this picture. This is a detail of a painting by the Scottish-Irish artist John Lavery. It's called The Artist's Studio, and you may be able to guess, not so much from this detail, that it is totally based on Las Meninas. But apart from that terrible derivation, it's an amazing, incredible work of art. And it shows the artist with his wife and their two daughters in the artist's studio in London. I remember very well my mother taking me to see this picture, and we spent a long time talking about it and thinking about it, because she told me at that moment that it was her very, very, very favourite painting in the world. And what I do find so remarkable about museums is that they are places for the present. They are places for the past, but they are also places where we can make connections between these worlds in ways that is very strong, very palpable, and really, really very, very, very unusual. So looking back, I can see how that moment of discovery in a place that I immediately found very, very welcoming really changed my life, because it set me off on a path to eventually study art history, become an art historian, and do the work that I do today. But that lovely memory doesn't just make me feel complacent and happy. It really pushes me further to consider how the gallery and other galleries can best feature their public and civic role, so that we can be a resource, we can be a challenge, we can be an inspiration and a solace for the people of Dublin and of the island, and indeed beyond. Thank you.